What's up, everybody? I'm doing squats today. It gets me in sort of a introspective mood. So I'm going to talk about a book that I read a while ago, and I've just been kind of skimming through it to refresh myself. It's called A Confession by Leo Tolstoy. It's very short. It's about 100 pages, and it's not a novel. It's a sort of nonfiction autobiography of his spiritual life. And it's really interesting because I felt like I could relate to it in many ways. So, Tolstoy, like a lot of people, was brought up, believing God created the world in 7 days, blah, 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 blah. And like a lot of young people, he questioned that faith. And once he found a good reason or a good company with which to reject it, he did. And he goes on to talk about how he became sort of a radical young student where he was part of all these socialist groups, all of these atheist groups, and he was very into this lifestyle. And he was also into a lifestyle of doing drugs, of drinking, of whoring, and various other forms of debauchery. But after several years of living his life this way, he became kind of depressed. And he noticed that many of his friends were becoming depressed as well. And he believes that this was because, despite the fact that they were a part of all these groups and stuff, his entire life was devoted basically to vindicating himself in his own debaucherous lifestyle, right? Not only that, but his entire life was devoted to tearing down things that made people happy. Right? So even though he didn't believe in God, he sort of recognized that devoting his life to convincing perfectly happy people that they shouldn't be happy was just making him miserable. He also found that his friends were also depressed, and some of them had even committed suicide. And so this led him to have sort of a breakdown of sorts, and so he left university to live in the country. And in the country, he has an interesting experience because he's surrounded by all these peasant farmers. He's this rich sort of young nobleman, and so he's always looked down on these people. But he notices that they're all so happy. They're all so content. They're poor. They work hard all day, but yet they've got beaming smiles on their faces, and they go to church every Sunday, and they're very happy, very content, and everything just sort of makes sense for them. And he starts mulling it around in his head that if life is supposed to be meaningless, or if it's supposed to be godless or faithless, then why are the godless people in his life so miserable? And why are the godly people so happy? So he decides he's going to become a Christian again. So he starts working with the peasants. He starts going to church. He starts taking the sacrament again in the Orthodox Church, because that's what he was raised in. And he's happy for a little while. But then he has a moment of clarity. He's standing in line to receive the sacrament in church, at the Orthodox Church. And the priest holds up the cracker to put into his mouth, and he says, "Do you believe that this will become the body of Christ once it enters you?" And Tolstoy stopped, and he kind of has this uncomfortable moment because he knows that he doesn't believe that. He knows that the transubstantiation, which is what that's called, is not real. It can't be. And he knows that he doesn't believe it. And this shakes him. And he enters another stage where he's kind of depressed. Because, he found this thing that he thought would make him happy, and that he thought would make the world make sense again. But it itself doesn't make sense. He knows that the peasant farmers and the churchgoers are still happy, but he's not. He can't be in the same way that they are. And he drives himself nuts, just sort of brooding over this idea that he can't be happy as an atheist, he can't be happy as a Christian, so what does he have to be happy for, right? He decides that the reason that the peasant farmers are able to accept this is because, for the most part, they're simple and because they're busy. You know, they work hard, they don't have time to sit around doubting the transubstantiation. They've got fields to plow and children to raise. And so he comes to this conclusion that these people, even though the transubstantiation is not true, even though Christianity, or the way that they practice Christianity, may not be true 100%, that because it makes them so content and it makes their lives make sense, there must be something that is true about it. And that following this path pushes them in the direction of the truth, of the sort of great thing in itself, you know, and it gives them sort of a conduit to, Tolstoy would say, it gives them a conduit to God, even if it is not perfect, right? And so Tolstoy is brooding over this, and he finishes the book by explaining a dream that he has that makes things clear for him once again. And in this dream, he's lying in his bed, and the bed is floating up in the clouds, and it starts to tip over forward, and he's trying not to fall down, and when he looks down, he sees this dark pit of despair and nothingness, and he knows he's about to fall into the abyss. But then he looks up, and up above him is light, is the sky, is the heavens. And when he looks up at the heavens, the bed stops slipping, and he feels safe. And so he concludes that, you know, even if he can't just be an Orthodox Christian and be happy, he should, if he wants to have his life make sense, if he wants to be happy, he should continue to pursue something that is higher than himself. And he would call it God. He would say, continue to pursue God in whatever way makes the most sense to you, because that is the only way to make your life make sense, or to be meaningful, you know. Otherwise, you risk slipping into despair, the despair that he himself went through several times in his life. So that's the book. I highly recommend it. It's really short. You can read it in an afternoon, you know, a lazy Saturday, and I found it really moving. I encourage you to read it even if you're an atheist, even if it makes you uncomfortable to read things that suggest that God is real or that God is worthwhile, because, believe it or not, people who disagree with you or who have different worldviews than you can also be very smart and have lessons that are worth teaching. And so you do no harm to yourself by learning and by reading books. You do much more harm to yourself by just cutting yourself off from things like that. So now watch these squats.